Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. How are we doing? How's everybody? So thank you very much, Israel. And just it's always NGNL has been a conference that this is just personal for me. So give me my 30 seconds. Like NGNL has been a conference that I've always wanted to be lucky enough to participate in because I think personally for me, like just being able to what's it called, like work with it, and I like Amsterdam a lot. So I've been to parts of Amsterdam, so the Netherlands. So it's an honor. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm kind of lost for words here, but it's an absolute honor for me to be here. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. So here today, I'm going to be talking about lazy loaded components in Angular, so I'm just going to start. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself in true, Dutch fashion. Hoe gaat het? I practice that a lot, so I believe I got it right. Hoe gaat het? So who am I? My name is Sani Yusuf, and I am Nigerian, but I live in England. So full on shout out to all the Nigerians watching. So I also am the founder of a small consulting called Hybrid, and that's basically what I used to do, those things I do around the world. And I'm also an author, a trainer. I really like to teach people. I like to pass on knowledge. I like to learn first. For me, it's very important I'm able to learn, because once I learn, then I can give back. And I feel like whoever gives back always has something to gain. I totally sound like a preacher now. And I'm just like Israel said, I'm a huge fan of the Avatar movie. So like for me, that's like, it simply is the best movie of all time. Like there's no exceptions. Like I could lose friends because of this particular argument. It's just the best thing. So yesterday was a sad day to hear that because of the coronavirus, it's been indefinitely postponed, at least by till 2022. But hey, we waited all our lifetime for the first one, so I don't mind waiting more than 12 years or 14 years for the second one. It's fine. And I'm very easy to find online, actually. You can find me at Sani Yusuf everywhere, SANIYUSUF. If you find anybody that looks half as pretty as this guy here and is not using that username, let me know so I can probably go and sue them. And yeah, you can read my stuff on Medium. Twitter, I'm very active, and LinkedIn as well, I'm very active. Yes, I'm one of those old people that's very active on LinkedIn, yes. So let's talk about lazy loading. So when we say lazy loading, a few things come in, depending on what technology stack you work with or who you are or anything like that. What comes to mind is different from person to person. But specifically, I want you to leave whatever. It doesn't matter if you're a React person, a Vue person, or a JavaScript person. I just want you to think in the context of web applications now in terms of lazy loading. So what is exactly lazy loading? So let's see how a traditional web page you would basically, if you create a traditional web application, right? You'd have, let's say, home.html, and then when somebody clicks a link on that particular web page, you'd basically like go to the server side. And that server side, you would have like multiple different pages, right? So you'd have like physical HTML files. And I say physical in an abstract sense, because you'd have like real files that you have created. So home.html, about.html, contacts.html, these are all separate files, right? And you'd go, so if I say click a link that says go to the contacts page, you'd go to the server and make a request. And then the server would then return you a new HTML page that will be rendered, right? Profile.html, for example, if we just click the profile page. And I think everybody that's worked with HTML, to some degree is very familiar with this pretty standard stuff, right? Server-side routing. And then around, I guess, the late 2000 well, just before 2010-ish, and early, of this particular decade or the last decade, the single page application revolution started. And before we actually talk about the single page architecture, let's understand why a single page application architecture became necessary. So let's go back to the traditional web application. The problem was that if you look at the traditional web application, right, if you look at the actual web page, a lot of it doesn't really change, right? Say, let's say you have a header and you have a footer, right? these are contents that's going to stay the same for the most part, right? The real thing that changes is the data. So if I click home to profile, header, footer remain the same, but the content in the middle of the page is what kind of like changes. So, but the problem is we are basically fetching. So let's assume that 60% of the web page is the same content, only the 40% that changes. But we're going to make another request and getting that same 60%, which we already have. And I think when people started using mobile phones, right, and started browsing the internet on their mobile phones, because the mobile phone has a much smaller RAM, a much smaller processor, and the internet is not as quick as it is on a traditional web, like laptop or desktop computer. And by the way, if you hear me say desktop, it's a Nigerian thing. It's just how I say desktop. So sorry about that. But that's how you would go on there and you would basically see these things. So that happened, and what people started thinking, how can we make that experience much better? And I think that's what partially gave birth to the rise of the single page application architecture. Now, in a single page application architecture, how does it actually work? Contrary to popular belief, it's not necessarily a new thing per se. The single page application architecture actually uses what I call the in-page routing. So with HTML, you can actually do ahref, and you can put a hashtag, and you can route to somewhere within a page. You can literally route inline, right? Now, what happens is in the single page application architecture, the only real full HTML physical file that exists on your server is actually the index.html, the entry point. There isn't really any other thing. All the other things are what I call partials or templates, right? Depending on what technology you use, they're partial. So this about.html is actually not a full replication of the index.html. It's just that part that you need swapped in and out. That's what it is. So you have these little partials, right? The parts of the application that change, right? So whenever you hit a request to maybe route to a page, you're not actually going to fetch a new entire page like we did in the previous one. What you are doing is you're fetching a partial, just a part of the page. If you are as old as I am, and I'm not very old, I like to think I am older than I am. But if you remember when, if you used Facebook very early on, when Facebook was still new, there was a time when somebody posted a new post or comment or something like that on your page, you'd have to refresh the page and scroll all the way back down to literally find that. I was a chronic Facebook user, so I had the time to do that. Because for whatever reason, my friends and I had this competition of who could have the most Facebook friends, right? But today we don't do that. When you're on Facebook or let's say Twitter as well, once there's a new post, it automatically reacts, right? And no pun intended. It automatically reacts, and the data just changes, and that's it. And the page just reacts and renders the new page. That's kind of like, and Twitter is one of the websites that actually used SPA architecture very early on. It has its pros and cons. For example, because you have only one specific HTML file, the search engine optimization can be very, very tricky. So if you are planning to create like a magazine where you want Google and all the other web page tools or search engine tools to be able to crawl your data to serve your users, a search engine single page application architecture is not good for you. But anyways, that's beside the point. So back to the single page single page application architecture, we have these partials. And now what happens is this same page, the index.html, we just replicate that. So we just take that part of the about HTML, the partial, and just insert it and then swap it out. That's basically how a single page application architecture worked. And during 2007 upwards, I think 2010, 11, 12, this is when the single page architecture really took off, and people started really using it as the de facto thing. Most of the frameworks, the JavaScript frameworks, jQuery aside, Angular, Ember, not sure about Ember, but I believe Angular, React, they all rely on the single page architecture because it was just much more flexible, right? And so I'm saying a lot of these lovely things about the single page architecture. So you might be asking, what the hell is the problem, Sani? You like to have bad news for us. Well, there's the problem. The first problem is, you remember with the single page application, the routing is happening on the front end. You're never actually, the only time you go to the server is the initial request to get that index.html file, right? And also they get all the partials, and then you load everything in the beginning, right? So when you say go from like home page to another page, all those partials are actually on your front end. So if you look at my last, let's go back here. This can actually be misleading. This is why I didn't label this a server. But this actually, what we have here with the index.html and the partials all have to be loaded, right? So, and also those partials must be loaded at first, which means, you know, as your application grows larger, the number of partials that you have also grows larger, which means the number of things that you have to load initially grows as well. So in a normal web application architecture, you're only loading that particular file, so you're just getting what you need. But in a single page architecture, you know, you need to load all those partials as well. So your initial load time was very, 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 very long, or grows like arithmetically within the number of partials you have. And that's not a very good recipe for like a great user experience. It's a terrible recipe for user experience, because the user is having to wait a long time to see their first particular page. Imagine if you go to a cookie website, you just want to see a recipe. This website has to load all the recipes. So this is not very necessarily great. And this was a big problem for AngularJS. I remember having an interview one time, and they were like, you know, there were hacks around system.js, module loaders, and all of that. And I had no clue what they were talking about. But it was a really, really big problem in AngularJS specifically, right? And then that's when, from Angular, which is 2 upwards, we had lazy loading. And I think Victor did a wonderful job in creating a route and their lazy loading, because they understood that for an enterprise application, that's almost, you know, it's impossible for you to do that. So how does Angular lazy loading work? Angular lazy loading basically allows you to, it's a built-in component routing, because with Angular, you're routing from component to component. You're always swiping in and out components, or exchanging components into the content area, right? So it's component routing, which means every component is tied to a route, right? Like you swipe in this component, it's / something, right? That's the only way you can get to that particular component. It is route-based component routing. And it uses the new, I think from Angular 8 upwards, it uses the new import syntax of JavaScript. It doesn't really use the, what's it called? The older syntax, which was a little bit tricky to learn as well, because if it was a little bit tricky. So that kind of thing, you kind of see that in there, and Angular also allows you for a custom strategy for lazy loading, which means, yes, lazy, you do not necessarily need to lazy load like by default. They don't have a gun to your head say lazy load, but I have a gun to your head, you better lazy load, because most applications, that's what you'd want to do. You're like I mean, it depends. If your application is just like 2 partials, 2 routes, then it's different. You might actually get a better experience. But they also allow you for custom lazy loader strategies. So for example, what if I wanted to lazy load the page, but if I'm on Wi-Fi, because I'm on like a very fast network Wi-Fi that is like 79 gigabits per second, I would actually want to load everything, because it can happen like this. Maybe you want to do that all custom, or maybe you want to work with your analytics team, like, hey, home and about page are the most visited, so we should always have those ready to go at a moment's notice. You can do that with Angular. Let's have a look at some code here. So if you look at the code here, this is what the lazy loading looks like in Angular. You would basically create a variable, right? With your routes here, like I have done here. You create this variable, and here I'm specifying the path name, which is called items, as you can see here. And then I'm saying load children, and I'm using an arrow function. And I'm using the standard JavaScript import, passing a path to what I want to import, that specific module. And then when I load that module, I get the specific class that is decorated with that module. So Angular has the concept of ng modules, which is like think of it as like a well-enclosed system of how you arrange things. Now, I don't want to get into whether ng module is good or not. I like it. but I don't want to start like World War IX here because yeah. But some people love it, some people hate it. I'm one of the people that actually think I like it. And this is what it looks like. So you use a TypeScript decorator that comes from the Angular core to decorate that specific class. And inside there, we would just call the router module of Angular to pass it this particular thing that we've created here. And that's what we do there, right? Okay. Next lesson class. And this is how you lazy load in Angular. And also you can, like I specified earlier, you can have custom lazy loading strategies, which means you can like preload all the modules, or, basically this is you turning lazy loading off, saying, hey, just preload everything. You can do whatever you want to, you can customize it. So you might be asking me, okay, Sani, you've talked about the problem, but you've also talked about the solution. So how can there possibly be a problem here? Now, it depends who you are. Do you might see this as a problem or a nice to have or a new feature, or subjective, right? For me, at one point, while I started using lazy loaded components, it became a problem for me. Lazy loading in Angular only allows you to load routes. So if you have a page where, let's say, you have like on that particular page, you make an Ajax call, and depending on what you get returned on the Ajax call, you want to load specific things. You cannot do that, because with Angular, you have to have the lazy loaded done ahead of time, the lazy loading ahead of time, because at build time, the compiler or the build tools will look into your syntax and find where it finds that import in your route, and it will build what we call chunks. So it basically says, okay, I'm just going to go and create like a little mini app here somewhere in your server. When you request this, I will go get it and then load it into the browser's memory. Does that make sense? Then after that, you don't load it again. So it has to work with routes / something, right? But what about just like the case I described? What about I've loaded my routes? I have, let's say, right, depending on who, like I have specified components for, let's say, all the top speakers in the Angular community. And we have Michael from Vienna, we have John Papa, we have Stephen Fluin, and we have the best of them all, Sani Yusuf, of course. What if I want to dedicate a specific component to all of these great people, right? With this, I have to have routes. But what if I just want it to be like hotwired? I couldn't be able to do that today. The only way I would be able to do that is I would have to have those components loaded as part of that route, and then ngIf my way in and out and hide and replace, which means that particular component becomes what we call a God component. It's so big, it grows arithmetically, right? That's where Angular component lazy loading comes through. And Angular component is a fairly new feature. I think from Angular 9, we can do this, and it allows you to do what we just do. So let's load up some code here. Let's see some code. And we can make this a little bit larger. Yes. So I have my little nice iframe here. And let's have a look at what it is. So here you can see it's a very basic. I could just make this a little bit larger because I don't know if everybody can see. Well, you never go wrong by making it too large. That's one thing I've noticed. So I hope everybody that is watching is able to see this. So here you can just see you have a lazy loaded component. So let's actually go to the editor view only first. Let's look at the code. Now I'm going to show you my code, and shout out to StackBlitz. I am using StackBlitz here, which is a very great online IDE. If you haven't used StackBlitz, you haven't lived yet. And you can see it's a standard Hello World Angular application, right? You can see here we have imports, we have declarations, 2 components, hello component and app component. And the app component is the bootstrap component. So let's start there. So if I go to app component.ts, you can basically see what I have here, right? If I look at the HTML, all I have is the word lazy component, and I have a button, and I also have a view container ref. Why do I have a view container ref or an ng container with a view, like a template reference? This is basically the spot where I want to inject my lazily loaded component inside, right? So I basically said, this is the spot. Think of it the same way you think of the Angular router, right? The router outlet. Very similar, not exactly the same, because the router outlet actually adds underneath, while this one adds inside. It's basically like a place where they say, this is exactly where I want to inject the dynamic content. The same way you think of transclusion. This is where you transclude that particular content in the case of, and here you can see. So let's see how I do that. Then I have this lazily loaded component, right? And all that component is just saying is, if you look at the HTML, is just showing this lazy text. Very basic component here. Very basic component. It's just saying I am a lazy component, right? So if we go to the HTML now, let's look at this particular app component, the TS. What we've done is we've gotten the handle of that lazy component container ref, right? The view container ref, and yes, we've done the whole static equals false for Angular since Angular 6, I guess. Here you can see I've injected two things: the view container ref, both come from the Angular core, and the component factory resolver. You can see that on line 15 to 18. Very important. You need both of them. So if you've done anything like dynamically injected a component before, this should be second nature to you. But there's a difference here. So you can see that I have a method called load lazy component. And this is the method that is tied in my HTML on line 3 to my button. You know, whenever I click my button, that component, that method will fire. So let's look at that method. So from line 21 to 27, we can see that particular method called load lazy component. And the first thing I do is I clear that view container, which is basically me saying, hey, Angular, if there's anything already injected into that little space here, which is what we have here, right? This little space here, I'm going to the HTML file now. On line 5, if there's anything injected inside of this particular view container ref, clear it out, because I'm about to put in some new content. If you don't do that, Angular is just going to append that content. If that's what you want, then no problem. That's not what I want. It's just what I call defensive programming, right? Just making sure. It's like clean your gloves. Then the next thing I do is I actually go and this is an async function. So it's an async await method I'm using. I basically say, go to this particular file, which is this file, because the file we want, which is this file here, the lazy component, right? Go and load this particular file here. Go and load it here. So the same way the build, when it sees the import, right? If you were doing on the route of a module level and it will create a chunk, that's the same thing that will happen here, I believe. And it would basically know that, okay, I see what you're trying to do here, but this happens on the fly. It doesn't necessarily create a chunk ahead of time. This is you actually lazily loaded. Go and read this particular file, get me that component, then use the component in that container, create me the component and resolve that. So the resolve component factory would go and take care of, okay, I'm gonna go do all of that for you. And now, as soon as we do that, basically it will get injected. So let's go ahead and try this. So let's check the preview here, right? So if we check the preview, if I click load lazy component, you can see that we have I am a lazy component here. So if I could like right click, and this is going to be available for you to see, you're basically going to see that that component has now been lazily loaded, and you can see that the router doesn't change. So remember our idea of the greatest Angular speakers. You know, we talked about Tara Minixic, Alyssa, Nicole, all of these great, amazing people. And then the greatest of them all, Sani Yusuf, remember? We can all have their own specific components, yeah? Yes, this is, and you can load that up. So this is really good. One more thing I will show you before I leave today, which is, what about the case where now let's go to our lazy component and like just do something cool, right? So I'm just going to go back to the editor and I'm saying, okay, you know what? I want to make this uppercase. I'm going to use the uppercase pipe, right? And I will save this. And let's go and check the preview. So we can see that Stackblade is saying, hey, I cannot find a pipe called uppercase. Whenever you see this error, this is basically Angular telling you that you don't have access to whatever you're trying to use. And let's go. If you think about it, the lazy component does not belong to any ng module. It doesn't. Let's look at this. It doesn't belong to app module. It's not declared in any ng module. It's just a component of its own. So of course, how would it get context to the common module, which is where the uppercase pipe comes from, right? And you find yourself sometimes needing imports from like different modules in there. How can you solve this problem with a lazy loaded lazy loaded component? The first thing you would do is you just come in there, you create an ng module declaration inside of the same file as your component. So I'll just declare this here, and I'll just uncomment this line here. So I basically declared this, and I've imported the common module. So basically, I've declared an ng module. I've created an ng module right there in my component. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Yes. Angular team, if you're watching this, please find a way for us to be able to like magically do this with a CLI, but now you have to do it manually as far as so far to the best of my knowledge. What you've done here is basically said, okay, this is a component, but it requires here, it belongs to its own module that, you know, is not imported anywhere, and it requires common module. What happens then is when now, if we go back to our application, right, and we go to the preview, and we wait for Stackbase to load, when we load this lazy component, you can see now it is uppercased. The context of that common module, you know, is now exists. And that's the benefit of lazy loaded module. So I'm running out of time here. I'm just going to quickly run, but this is very simple, very great, you know. Now, the next thing is, when do you use lazy loaded components? It's a simple answer. It all comes down to your implementation. Whenever you want to use a lazy loaded component, there is no right or wrong answer, but I think this is a very powerful feature. A lot of things you want to do with lazy loaded components, you can do with lazy loaded routes, but there are very many use cases that you can do this. Don't go looking for lazy loaded components use cases. When you find yourself needing to do things, it will naturally announce itself. And that's my last statement in terms of like advice for when to use this. Well, without any further ado, this was a very short talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now. Also, feel free to throw them on my DMs on Twitter, on Instagram, any platform. Absolutely amazing. Thank you very much.